In the depths of Millfield Correctional Facility, something impossible happened on the night of October 13, 1947. A man named Thomas Whitmore simply vanished from his maximum security cell, leaving behind only a worn copy of Edgar Allan Poe's complete works, and a mystery that would haunt the prison staff for decades to come. What guards discovered the next morning defied every law of physics and reason. The book lay open on Whitmore's cat, its pages yellowed and brittle, but with fresh ink still glistening on the final page of The Fall of the House of Usher. Written in Whitmore's unmistakable handwriting were words that should never have existed. And so I, Thomas Whitmore, took my place within these walls of madness, trading one prison for another, but finding in fiction the freedom that reality denied me. This is not just another prison escape story. This is something far stranger, far darker, and far more terrifying than any warden's nightmare could conjure. Thomas Whitmore was no ordinary prisoner. Convicted of a series of brutal murders that terrorized the small town of Millfield for 3 long years, he possessed an intellect that chilled even the most hardened investigators. During his trial, witnesses described his ability to, quote, entire passages from memory. His obsession with literature, spanning from ancient Greek tragedies to contemporary horror fiction, and his unsettling habit of speaking about fictional characters as if they were old friends. The murders themselves bore hallmarks of someone who had studied the great literary killers. Each crime scene was arranged with theatrical precision, echoing the methodical madness found in the pages of Gothic novels. The victims were discovered posed like characters from tragic plays, their final moments apparently orchestrated to mirror scenes from classic literature. When authorities finally captured Whitmore, they found his modest apartment transformed into a shrine to the written word. Thousands of books lined every wall, their margins filled with meticulous notes in a handwriting so precise it resembled medieval manuscript illumination. But it was the content of these notes that truly disturbed investigators. Whitmore hadn't simply been reading these books. He had been attempting to enter them, documenting methods for what he called literary transmigration. His journals, discovered hidden beneath loose floorboards, contained detailed theories about the permeable nature of fictional boundaries. Page after page described his belief that sufficiently obsessive readers could actually cross into the worlds created by authors, becoming characters themselves rather than mere observers. The final entries, written just days before his arrest, spoke of breakthrough discoveries and imminent success. At Millfield Correctional, Whitmore became a model prisoner, at least on the surface. He spent his days in the prison library, a cramped room filled with donated books that previous inmates had largely ignored. The elderly librarian, Margaret Hawthorne, later testified that Whitmore would sit motionless for hours, his eyes moving across pages with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable. Other prisoners gave him a wide berth, spreading whispered rumors about the strange sounds that emanated from his cell at night. They spoke of hearing multiple voices engaged in conversation, though Whitmore's cellmate had been transferred weeks earlier. Guards dismissed these reports as typical prison superstition, but the overnight staff began to notice something unsettling. During their rounds, Cell Block C, where Whitmore was housed, would fall into an unnatural quiet after midnight. The usual sounds of restless inmates, coughing, snoring, and occasional outbursts would fade into complete silence. In that silence, those brave enough to listen closely reported hearing what sounded like pages turning, followed by whispered recitations in languages they couldn't identify. Warden James Morrison, a practical man who had run Millfield for over 2 decades, initially dismissed the reports as nonsense. But as weeks turned to months, even he couldn't ignore the growing unease among his staff. Guards requested transfers away from Cell Block C. The prison chaplain refused to conduct services in that wing, claiming he felt an oppressive presence that made prayer impossible. The first concrete sign that something was wrong came during a routine cell inspection 6 months into Whitmore's sentence. Guard Captain Robert Hayes discovered that every book in Whitmore's possession showed signs of unusual wear. The pages weren't simply dog-eared from reading, they appeared to be physically deteriorating. as if the words themselves were slowly fading from the paper. More disturbing were the additions Whitmore had made to the texts. Using what appeared to be blood mixed with ink, he had inserted himself into story after story. In Moby Dick, a character named Thomas White appeared as a crew member on the Pequod. In Frankenstein, detailed marginal notes described observations made by someone claiming to have witnessed Victor's experiments firsthand. When confronted about these modifications, Whitmore simply smiled and asked Hayes if he had ever wondered what it would be like to live forever within the pages of a great story, to become part of something larger and more meaningful than ordinary existence. The night of October 13th began like any other. The evening count showed all prisoners accounted for, cells secured, and guards posted at their stations. But as the midnight shift began their first round, they discovered something that would shatter their understanding of what was possible. Whitmore's cell stood empty, its heavy steel door still locked from the outside, the bars on his single window undisturbed, no signs of struggle, no evidence of escape attempts, no tools or contraband that might explain his disappearance. The only items remaining were his prison uniform, neatly folded on the cot, and the book. Guard Lieutenant Patricia Vance, first to enter the empty cell, later described the scene with a mixture of professional precision and barely contained terror. The book lay open to the final pages of The Fall of the House of Usher, a story about the collapse of both a family and their ancestral home. But these weren't the pages Poe had written. The original ending, describing the narrator's escape as the house crumbles into the dark lake, had been completely rewritten. In its place, a new conclusion told of a different kind of escape entirely. The narrator, no longer content to simply witness the Usher family's doom, had chosen to remain within the house, to become part of its dark history, rather than flee from it. But this wasn't merely Whitmore's interpretation of Poe's story. The handwriting that filled the margins and rewrote entire passages was his. But the ink appeared to shift and change as observers watched. Some witnesses swore they saw the words rearranging themselves, forming new sentences that described events happening in real time. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a forensic document examiner called in from the state capitol, spent 3 days analyzing the book. Her final report, classified by prison officials and never released to the public, contained findings that challenged everything she thought she knew about physical evidence. The ink used in Whitmore's editions tested positive for human blood, but not entirely his blood. Mixed within were traces of other genetic material, DNA, that didn't match any known individual. More impossibly, carbon dating suggested that some of the editions had been written decades before Whitmore's birth, despite the handwriting being unmistakably his. Under ultraviolet light, hidden text became visible throughout the book. Written in what appeared to be the same blood ink mixture were detailed descriptions of other worlds, other realities where the boundaries between fiction and truth had dissolved completely. These hidden passages spoke of libraries that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, of books that served as doorways between worlds, and of readers who had discovered the ultimate form of literary criticism, becoming the story itself. Prison psychiatrist Dr. Michael Torres had conducted weekly sessions with Whitmore throughout his incarceration. His session notes, recovered after the disappearance, painted a picture of a man undergoing a gradual but fundamental transformation. Early interviews showed a cunning but essentially human criminal. Later sessions revealed someone who spoke increasingly of fictional events as personal memories. In their final meeting, just 3 days before the disappearance, Whitmore had told Dr. Torres something that the psychiatrist initially dismissed as elaborate delusion. He claimed to have discovered the secret of what he called narrative existence, a state of being where consciousness could inhabit stories as easily as bodies inhabit physical space. According to Torres's notes, Whitmore described meetings with characters from classic literature, claiming to have shared meals with Jay Gatsby, discussed philosophy with Hamlet, and learned dark secrets from Professor Moriarty. He spoke of these encounters not as fantasies, but as memories of actual experiences that had occurred within the pages of books. The investigation into Whitmore's disappearance consumed months of police resources and federal attention. FBI agents, specializing in impossible crimes, examined every aspect of the case, searching for rational explanations that refused to reveal themselves. Prison security. Footage from that night showed nothing unusual, just empty corridors and locked doors that had remained locked. Witnesses among the prison staff were interviewed repeatedly, their testimonies subjected to lie detector tests and psychological evaluation. Every guard, every prisoner, every staff member was considered a potential accomplice in an elaborate escape scheme. But no evidence of conspiracy ever emerged, leaving investigators with a mystery that defied their most creative theories. Book itself became the subject of intense scrutiny. Literary experts analyzed Whitmore's editions, comparing his writing style to the original authors whose works he had modified. What they found challenged their understanding of how literary influence and inspiration actually worked. Editions weren't simply imitations or parodies of classic styles. They demonstrated a level of integration with the original texts that suggested intimate familiarity with the author's techniques, their thought processes, their personal struggles and triumphs. He wrote like someone who had actually collaborated with Poe, Melville, and Shelley, producing seamless continuations that literary scholars struggled to distinguish from authentic work. Professor Amanda Richardson of Harvard's English department, a leading authority on 19th century Gothic literature, spent months analyzing the modified text of The Fall of the House of Usher. Her conclusion, published in a limited academic journal, suggested that Whitmore's editions actually improved upon Poe's original work, adding layers of psychological complexity that the master of horror himself might have envied. But it was Richardson's private notes, discovered after her own mysterious disappearance 3 years later, that revealed the truly disturbing nature of her findings. She had become convinced that the additions to the book were continuing to evolve. That new text was appearing even as the book sat locked in police evidence storage. The ripple effects of the Whitmore case extended far beyond Millfield Correctional Facility. Prison libraries across the country began restricting access to certain books, particularly works of Gothic horror and psychological thrillers. Wardens, spooked by reports of the impossible escape, instituted new policies requiring daily inventory of all reading materials in maximum security facilities. But these precautions proved insufficient. Over the following years, similar disappearances occurred in prisons from California to Maine. In each case, the missing inmate had been an avid reader with a particular fascination for dark literature. And in each case, books were found with new editions written in the prisoner's handwriting, describing their entry into fictional worlds. The pattern was always the same: maximum security inmates with no possibility of conventional escape, cells that remained locked from the outside, and modified books that served as the only evidence of what might have happened. Prison officials, embarrassed by their inability to explain these events, began classifying such incidents as successful escapes through unknown means, filing reports that mentioned everything except the impossible nature of the disappearances. Margaret Hawthorne, the elderly librarian who had observed Whitmore's reading habits, provided perhaps the most chilling insight into what might have occurred. In an interview conducted years after her retirement, she described noticing changes in Whitmore's physical appearance during his final weeks at Millfield. His skin had taken on a peculiar pallor, she recalled, as if he was slowly fading from the world. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, had developed a distant quality that reminded her of someone looking at scenes visible only to them. Most disturbing of all, she began to have difficulty remembering his face even while speaking with him, as if his physical presence was becoming somehow less substantial with each passing day. The night of his disappearance, Hawthorne had been working late in the library, cataloging new donations. She reported hearing sounds from the direction of cell block C that didn't match any normal prison activity. Instead of the usual human sounds of incarceration, she heard what she described as pages rustling in wind that didn't exist, followed by voices reading aloud in perfect unison, as if multiple speakers were reciting the same text simultaneously. When morning came and news of Whitmore's disappearance spread through the prison, Hawthorne rushed to check the library's inventory. Every book that Whitmore had borrowed during His incarceration showed signs of recent disturbance, despite having been properly shelved and undisturbed for hours. Pages were warm to the touch, bindings creaked as if recently opened, and several volumes contained new marginalia that hadn't existed the day before. The modified copy of Poe's complete works, found in Whitmore's cell, wasn't the only book affected by his disappearance. The library's entire Gothic literature section had been altered, with dozens of volumes containing new editions written in Whitmore's distinctive handwriting. Characters bearing his name appeared in stories where they had never existed, always integrated so seamlessly that casual readers might assume they had always been there. These discoveries led to a disturbing realization. Whitmore hadn't simply disappeared into one story. He had somehow inserted himself into an entire literary universe, becoming a character who existed across multiple narratives. Moving between stories like a reader browsing different books on a shelf, Dr. Chen's classified report included photographs of pages that had been blank during her initial examination but had somehow acquired text overnight, written in the blood ink mixture that defied conventional analysis. These new editions described Whitmore's experiences as a fictional character, his observations of other literary figures, and his growing understanding of what he called the true nature of written reality. One passage, appearing in the margins of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, provided a first-person account of meeting both personalities, describing conversations that revealed aspects of Steve's famous character that no reader had ever imagined. Another addition to Dracula detailed encounters with the Count himself, written from the perspective of someone who had gained the vampire's trust and learned secrets that Bram Stoker had never conceived. But perhaps most unsettling were the additions that appeared to be messages directed at the real world, at the people investigating his disappearance. Hidden throughout various texts were fragments that, when pieced together, formed a coherent communication from wherever Whitmore had gone. He described his new existence as neither life nor death, but something entirely different. He had become, in his own words, a citizen of the realm of imagination, free to wander through stories as others walk through cities. He claimed to have found others like himself, readers who had made the same transition from reality to fiction, forming a community of literary refugees who had chosen the certainty of stories over the chaos of real life. These messages contained warnings as well as descriptions. Whitmore wrote of dangers inherent in crossing between fictional and real worlds, of readers who had become lost in narratives too complex for their consciousness to navigate, of stories that had grown hungry for new characters and would trap unwary visitors within their pages forever. The investigation officially closed after 2 years with no resolution, filed away as an unsolved case that embarrassed everyone involved. But the book remained in evidence storage, continuing to evolve, with new editions that appeared with disturbing regularity. Guards assigned to check on stored evidence began reporting that the book seemed to be writing itself, pages filling with new text that chronicled adventures in fictional worlds that shouldn't exist. Prison staff who had worked during Whitmore's incarceration began experiencing strange dreams after his disappearance. They reported vivid nightmares where they found themselves trapped within the pages of books, unable to distinguish between their dreaming and waking lives. Several requested transfers to other facilities, claiming that Millfield itself had become contaminated by whatever force had taken Whitmore. Warden Morrison, who had dismissed early reports of supernatural activity, became obsessed with finding a rational explanation for the disappearance. He spent his final years before retirement poring over security footage, interviewing staff members, and consulting with experts in fields ranging from quantum physics to medieval alchemy. His personal files, discovered after his death, revealed a man who had been slowly driven to madness by an event that challenged everything he believed about the nature of reality. The most disturbing discovery in Morrison's files was a series of photographs taken over the months following Whitmore's disappearance. They showed the same page of the modified Poe book, but each photo revealed additional text that hadn't been visible in previous images. The page was continuing to write itself, adding new paragraphs that described Whitmore's ongoing adventures in fictional worlds. with a level of detail that suggested they were actually happening somewhere. Modern experts who have studied copies of the photographs speak of seeing evidence of what they term temporal narrative displacement, a theoretical condition where events occurring in fictional time begin to influence physical reality. The implications of such a phenomenon, if genuine, would fundamentally alter human understanding of consciousness, reality, and the power of written language. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Whitmore case lies not in what happened to him, but in what his disappearance revealed about the books themselves. Literary scholars who have examined the modified texts report a growing suspicion that many classic works of literature contain hidden dimensions, unexplored narrative spaces where additional stories wait to be discovered by readers bold enough to look for them. Some researchers now believe that every book exists as more than just words on paper, that each narrative creates its own pocket of reality where the events described actually occur in some form. If this theory is correct, then Thomas Whitmore didn't escape into fantasy. He simply found a doorway that had always existed, hidden within the space between written words and human imagination. The modified copy of Poe's complete works remains in storage at an undisclosed government facility, continuing to generate new text at irregular intervals. Recent editions have described a vast library that exists between all stories, a place where characters from different narratives meet and interact, sharing experiences across the boundaries that traditionally separate one book from another, and, sometimes, according to the staff brave enough to check on the book, new messages appear that seem directed at specific readers. Invitations written in Whitmore's distinctive handwriting that ask simple questions. Are you tired of being trapped? In reality, would you like to discover what lies beyond the final page of your favorite story? The door is always open for those who know how to look. These are the facts of the Thomas Whitmore case, as strange and impossible as they appear. A man who murdered for the love of literature, who studied the boundaries between fiction and reality until he found a way to cross them, and who now exists somewhere between the pages of every book that has ever moved a reader to forget the world around them, whether you believe this story or dismiss it as elaborate fiction. Remember this: every time you lose yourself in a book, every time you feel so absorbed in a narrative that reality fades away, you are walking the same path that Thomas Whitmore walked. The only difference is that most readers eventually close the book and return to the world they know. Whitmore simply chose never to close the book at all. His final message, appearing just last year in the margins of a library copy of The Fall of the House of Usher, discovered in Portland, Oregon, serves as both warning and invitation to anyone who has ever wondered what it would be like to step through the looking glass of literature. The stories are waiting, and they have been waiting forever. All you have to do is want them more than you want anything else. But remember, once you cross over, the only way home is to become the ending yourself. Thomas Whitmore escaped from Millfield Correctional Facility on October 13, 1947, and he's still escaping. Every time someone opens a book and wonders what it would be like to never leave the story behind, in a world where the impossible regularly masquerades as the everyday, perhaps the strangest thing about his case is not that it happened, but that it doesn't happen more often. The book waits, its pages open, its words shifting and changing with each new reader, and somewhere between the lines, in the spaces where punctuation marks pause and paragraphs break, Thomas Whitmore continues his eternal escape, free at last in a prison of his own choosing, forever and never coming home.